Hello, extempers, speech and debaters, and everybody else. It is me, YuYu,
And me, Spencer.
and welcome to the Half Hour Podcast, where we sit and talk for more than half an hour about a random topic that is currently going on in the world. Today, we're gonna spill the tea, all right? We're gonna get into the nitty-gritty, dirty details of the Pandora Papers. And if you didn't know what the Pandora Papers are, they're basically a set of a lot of data and a lot of information about all the corrupted activities of rich billionaires and political leaders around the world. And we're gonna take a deep dive on that and see what it has to offer us. But before we jump into that, let's take an appreciation for my change of scenery. I finally have better lighting, and our YouTube videos might be a little bit more pleasant to watch. But also, we again want to thank everyone for watching our videos, tuning into our videos, giving us great feedback. We're happy that we're helping out and giving you inspiration to do Extemp and making Extemp look like a less difficult event and more of a fun one. So yeah, that's what I want to mention.
On top of that, if you haven't been subscribed to the YouTube channel, do it. There's no excuse as to why you shouldn't be subscribed to us. We are posting there. It looks like what we're doing is every Wednesday now. And subscribers get content early. So if you are subscribed to the channel, you will get the podcast in the morning of Wednesday when it is revealed to everywhere else on the night of Wednesdays. Even if you're not subscribed, you can still find it early in the morning, but subscribers get notified, and notifications of us posting early is really good. So that is helpful to you. It is beneficial for you guys. It helps us with the YouTube algorithm as well. So make big number go bigger. On top of that, this episode does have a ton to cover, so we will do our best to cover it in a reasonable time. And we're going to limit the possible question today to only one. As this podcast will discuss, this may be one of the biggest scandals that has happened internationally in possibly the last 10 years. There's a lot of information, and we're only going to cover a small majority of it. So there will be more links to extra discussion points in the sources of this video, but you can also research and find a whole bunch more pertaining to other international problems or international scandals that are embedded within this. When reading through sources, make sure to take everything with a grain of salt, and I'll mention exactly why with that in a minute. But read a wide variety of sources ranging from impacts that are in the United Kingdom to the United States to Saudi Arabia, etc. And that is I think, a really important thing that we should mention right off the gates, because this impacts a ton of countries. This is not just a US impact, this is a United Kingdom impact. This is an entire European Union impact, an entire American impact, North and South. There's just so much with this. Even if we cover a significant portion of it in our normal time, we still haven't covered it all. And that's completely truthful here.
Yeah, and hopefully this video will help you out in your Extemp questions just generally, because it might cover a whole bunch of countries, and there's a whole variety of where you can go with this question, even though we're just doing one right now. So really, this video, we hope, will just help you help give you a strong basis about what the Pandora Papers are, what's going on in the international community and how it affects everybody. So if you ever get a question that deals with the international country, so for example, like, I don't know, Jordan, you could maybe tie it back to the Panama Papers or Pandora Papers even though it's not necessarily about the Pandora Papers, but it like relates to Jordan, and we'll get more into that later. Also, another thing that I would like to mention is the other like big scandal that you could look into would be the Panama Papers. The Pandora Papers is somewhat like an extension of the Panama Papers, but looking into the Panama Papers could also give you more insight into, you know, the scandal of offshore bank accounts and how rich people are avoiding taxes and committing illicit activities in monetarily.
And just to kind of keep the train kind of moving a little bit here, and jumping off of YuYu's point, a lot of the questions that pertain to like a very complex topic like this will most likely be descriptive, and all they're going to ask for is like the meaning of it. It's really not going to go into too much about like what should be done with it. Like if that's more of like a nationals based topic or like a much bigger tournament. So I think that's important to note, before we jump into this. Understanding a lot more of the background is what you're going to need here. And if YuYu has any other points with that, we'll just jump right in. So let's start with the most important question that people may have. What are the Pandora Papers? And I know YuYu just gave a brief description. I'm going to dive way more into detail here. The first thing I want to note with kind of my background information, I'm only using one article, and I'm using a BBC article. That's the first one linked in the description. And this answers a lot of questions that people have and provides a ton of background information. Now, this is specific to the United Kingdom when it comes to BBC. So we're going to talk a lot about the UK specific with its background, just to kind of show you the impact of what's going on within even a smaller country compared to the United States. But note that this is not only an impact for the United Kingdom, this is a global impact, and this is not just one country. I will only cover one country. So, what are the Pandora Papers? BBC writes, quote, "The Pandora Papers is a leak of almost 12 million documents that reveals hidden wealth, tax avoidance, and, in some cases, money laundering by some of the world's rich and powerful. More than 600 journalists in 117 countries have been trawling through the files from 14 sources for months, finding stories that are being published this week. The data was obtained by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, also known as the ICIJ, in Washington, D.C., which has been working with more than 140 media organizations on its biggest ever global investigation. In essence, journalists have found a load of information about wealthy individuals, finding ways that they are gaining more wealth in ways that what we might think is illegal. The leak is conducted by different news journalists across the world, in which they're trying to expose like real problems that persist in society. I think a really good way to examine this is similar to like yellow journalism, and that's maybe a very far stretch here, but they're really trying to expose what's going on and say something has to be done about this. And that's really what the Pandora Papers is going for. And that would probably be your best historical example to bring light to this. Some of the information that specifically impacts the United Kingdom, as released by the Pandora Paper reporters through BBC, include the following. 1. Owners of more than 1,500 UK properties have bought offshore firms, some of which may have been accused of corruption. 2. The Qatari ruling family avoided an £18.5 million tax on a London supermansion. Number 3. Sir Philip and Lady Green went on a property spree after offloading the BHS retail chain, which went on to collapse. 4. The Tory donor that was involved in one of Europe's biggest corruption scandals. Number 5, a spending spree by the King of Jordan that was 70 million pounds that was spent on properties in the United States and the United Kingdom was conducted through secretly owned companies. Number 6, the Azerbaijan's leading family is involved in more than 400 million pounds of property deals that have been kept secret from the public. Number 7, the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic has failed to declare an offshore investment company that was used to purchase 2 French villas for 12 million pounds. And number 8, Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta's family secretly owned a network of offshore companies for decades. Good chance I mispronounced about 3 or 4 things in there. So that's a lot. And that's just specific to impact of the United Kingdom. Remember, this is investigative journalists from across the globe finding numbers of impacts that range from rich people getting more wealthy in the United Kingdom, rich people getting more wealthy in the United States, rich people getting more wealthy in Jordan, with politicians and extremely wealthy individuals. And remember, this is only the United Kingdom's impact. Okay? And there's more involved with the UK. But there's a little bit that's also happening within the European Union that's shown in that BBC article. You can go and read through more of that. Some of the most powerful people, as they note, are using offshore companies to promote their wealth. And specifically, it examines 330 politicians from 90 different countries. That's a lot. There are a lot of people that have been exposed and have been told, hey, you're gaining wealth in what seems to be means that are illegal. Our papers contain 14 different sources worth of 11,903,676 files, or to put it in an easier perspective, 2.94 terabytes worth of data. And nowadays, that is nearly 3 computers worth of information filled completely. Most computers that people buy now are going to consist of 1 terabyte of hard drive. So you have 3 computers worth of information in all of this data. Breaking it down more, it consists of 6.4 million documents, 2.9 million images, 1.2 million emails, 467,000 spreadsheets, and 887,000 other sources of information that these journalists have found and have exposed. Compared to previous international leaks, the Pandora Papers rank second in the most amount of files and first in the amount of data since 2013. To walk through those comparisons, in 2013, there was what was called the offshore leaks, which contained 260 gigabytes of information worth of 2.5 million files. In 2016, you had the Panama Papers, which was kind of the predecessor to this, worth of 2.6 terabytes of information and 11.5 million files. In 2017, you have the Paradise Papers, which consists of 1.4 terabytes of information worth of 13.4 million files. Comparatively speaking, the Pandora Papers, as mentioned earlier, is 2.94 terabytes, which is the highest amount, and 11.9 million files, which is just behind the Paradise Papers in 2017. So there's a lot of information that's been revealed. And the Pandora Papers, in essence, turned around and gathered the most information and gave a massive international leak about wealthy individuals. Here's a really good question, though. Everything that we're talking about, is this technically illegal? And the answer is, in short, no. And that's kind of the unfortunate truth. It should be illegal. And that's a lot of what these journalists are trying to say. All of these ways that these wealthy individuals are gaining money or finding ways to continuously hold their wealth is, in fact, methods that these journalists are trying to expose and saying, we ought to make this illegal, or this needs to be done. This needs to be fixed. But let's break down the actual explanations as to why what is happening is not illegal. The first one is, well, what we just talked about, loopholes. Basically, these exist causing wealthy people to find ways to avoid paying their taxes. And this is like having an offshore company, right? Or having some kind of offshore whatever. Okay. Oftentimes, society looks at this as completely unethical. However, this is operating within the law. If you find a loophole that avoids you paying your taxes, congratulations, you found something that is avoiding your taxes. It's wrong, but you're operating within the law. The second explanation is wealthy people may hold assets in other countries for reasons such as avoiding cyber attacks or the threat of an unstable government. Okay, well, that's a fair argument. If you're going to hold assets in another country because you're afraid of some kind of attack or the government's just kind of sketchy in the first place, then you want to hold your money somewhere else because the last thing you want is to lose it, right? So holding it in a different country that may not be as vulnerable is a fair thing to do. But is that a good reason to be avoiding paying your taxes? Probably not. And the last one is a quote directly from BBC. It says, quote, although having secretive offshore assets is not illegal, using a complex network of secret companies to move around money and assets is the perfect way to hide the proceeds of criminality. That's the other big reason as to why it's not illegal, right? It's maybe a way to hide different ways of money laundering. And that's exactly what is being shown with some of these examples that we have provided. The Panama Papers back in 2016 showed that wealthy people are finding ways to avoid paying their taxes. And first off, I would hope that everybody knows by this point that this is not an untrue statement. But now the Pandora Papers are finding something new. Quote, the people that could end the secrecy offshore are themselves benefiting from it. So there's no incentive for them to end it. Yeah, if you have been able to hold a secret for so long and you're benefiting from it, there's no real incentive for you to keep that secret. It's like if you were helping wait a table and you ended up getting a tip, but it's really your coworker's table and it's like a $50 tip. You invest it in the stock market and you make a whole bunch of money from it. There's no reason for you to end holding that money. Congratulations, you've made $5,000 off of $50. I mean, that's something that can happen. So this is a really good example of people are trying to find a way to show their accumulation of wealth and hiding a ton of it from the original government. So how much money is left out there and hidden offshore? And the answer is, we don't know. Hey, as much as we would like to know, we just don't. But we estimate that it's between $5.6 trillion to $32 trillion. And with that being said, the International Monetary Fund estimates that governments are losing up to $600 billion in taxes. That's a huge problem. Losing $600 billion in taxes can fund better education systems. It can fund needs for protecting the most vulnerable in the midst of a pandemic. It can go into research and development. That's $600 billion that really matters to a government. And BBC did note that the only real one of the biggest problems with this is if you're hiding all of this money, it directly impacts them too, because they have children that are going to school. Unless if they're homeschooling their children are being directly impacted by their ability to hold their money and not actually pay their taxes like they're supposed to. And with governments losing this money, it impacts not only other programs that could be there, but their own children. It's completely ridiculous. Biases aside, in short, the Pandora Papers are a scary impact that shows that wealthy people have been hiding money offshore. And while what they are doing is not illegal, it is important to know this impact. And simply put, I think YuYu, this is a real big problem. And I think journalists have been trying to expose this for a very long time, clearly. And the fact that it is now taken up to this point in time for us to look at this and go, wow, we've got a problem. And still many people not knowing about it shows that we have a impact that needs to start being discussed.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Like, this is not some type of small thing that you could just like brush off the next day or should brush off. This this is huge. And like while this expose was released 2 weeks ago, we still thought it was important to talk about now because it's something that all of you should know. And the impacts of it, while like these actions are legal, they have very ethical implications that could damage our international community and damage the United States where we are. I think I might be reading this wrong, but I think one of the sources that we have linked down below, it also mentions the statistic that these, like the total accumulation of money that was held offshore or was like exposed in the papers was 3 times the amount of debt the United States have. But like I could have been reading that wrong. Go back and check. But either way, it is a large sum of money that we could have been using for something else, that we could have been using for infrastructure plans, that we could be using towards fighting climate change, et cetera, et cetera. Yet you have these individuals who are hoarding their money, putting them in offshore bank accounts, putting them through private businesses that are in other countries in order to get away with illicit activities because they want to keep their money. And like, we might be like, hey, you know, people like money, like I like money, what's wrong with that, right? There's something wrong with that when it actually implicates the world. I was gonna say like millions or billions of people, but like it implicates the world because of these actions, since it's not just one person doing it, it is a lot of people doing it. And this big of an issue, just to put it into perspective, required 600 journalists from 150 media outlets in 117 countries to expose this many people. But I think Spencer summed up all of the issues pretty well. He explained to you the background of the Pandora Papers and what they are and what they've included. But now that you have this information, what now? Like, what do we do with this information? What's going to happen? And I'll try to keep my part just a little short because I want to mention what the effects of the Pandora Papers being released was, just very briefly, so that y'all can go out and research on your own, see what countries that you're interested in and how they're dealing with it. So it is shocking information and has caused quite a storm in the international community, especially within states that these exposed leaders are from. Then again, that's not really surprising since the Pandora Papers basically exposed 330 politicians within 90 different countries, as Spencer said. So let's dive into some of them. You'll find that there are countries completely denying or covering up the fact that their national leader engaged in these atrocious monetary actions. Those countries mainly include Russia and Jordan. As Spencer already mentioned, King Abdullah II of Jordan was found to be spending millions of pounds on luxury homes, and pounds is in the currency. But the news outlets there have yet to release anything about these claims. And the one journalist that did got a call from the Jordan Intelligence Agency telling him to take it down or stay quiet about it. And even if he wasn't going to take it down, it got taken down anyway. So it didn't really matter. The royal court, however, themselves come out and said, so what? He's bought some properties, but this has nothing to do with the state's money. It's his own money that he's using to purchase these luxury houses in all of these other countries. So really, they don't want this information being used against them or against King Abdullah. To put it in context, though, Jordan is a very poor country, and its citizens need the money to have more infrastructure and to have more opportunity and ability to grow their country. So the fact that King Abdullah was able to kind of get away with this and accumulate all of this wealth to buy properties in other countries is kind of upsetting to the people of Jordan, because it's kind of okay, so you could spend all this money on yourself, but what about us? Do you not even care about us? What's going on, man? But other than that, the same thing has been happening for Russia. It was found that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, had a fling a while ago, and that lady suspiciously obtained a very luxurious apartment after the birth of her daughter. Now, people have made allegations that this was his daughter, and that's why he used this, or that's why he used this type of money to do that. But in order to do that, he had to go through offshore bank accounts to funnel it to her. Now, among his inner circle, there have also been allegations against them for retaining illegal funds and or storing funds offshore to avoid taxation. But what's interesting here is that news reporters in Russia have written and published works about the issue, but the Kremlin has refused to acknowledge that these claims have any basis whatsoever, and that there has been no actual proof that these claims are true or that there are illegal actions. And as we've discussed, even if they're not illegal actions, there are ethical implications. The US has also faced backlash from the international community and within our own borders too. Actually, most people thought that the Pandora Papers were part of an American scheme, or at least thought that the US was mainly to blame for the illegal actions that took place. It was revealed that Sioux Falls in South Dakota was actually an international tax haven for almost everyone because of the structure of their financial management laws in regards to trusts or companies. And as a result of this, Congress introduced the Enablers Act, which would finally force lawyers to actually follow anti-money laundering regulations that the US has agreed to on the international level. Previously, lawyers have been able to bypass these laws through loopholes, as we've seen and heard, and helped politicians, big businesses, owners avoid taxation and get away with illicit monetary activity. But also good to note that some of these lawyers have done this activity themselves and engage in what we would consider to be unfair monetary activity. But besides the US, Pakistani leader Imran Khan, which I thought was a very interesting type story, but let me get into it. He wasn't revealed to have engaged in any of these activities, but the people within his circle were, and he actually came out and tweeted that he was going to look more into it and look more into this and will use appropriate actions to take care of the issue. And what was really interesting and funny to me was that he also called out the international community to treat this grave injustice like climate change. Actual quote, go look it up. Pretty cool. But what is very interesting is that it's a very interesting comparison between this situation and the climate change situation, because as the international community has acknowledged climate change is an issue, you really haven't done much except say that they're going to do something to reduce their contribution to climate change, but nothing was really done. So there's this weird parallel here between acknowledging the issue but not really doing anything to solve the issue. There has been a push from the international community though, and they push to enact some action so that they're more transparent about finances of a country to the public and to reduce or prevent illicit funds activities. The UN Financial Accountability, Transparency, and Integrity Panel, or FACTI, have provided a list of measures they should adopt. These measures include full implementation of the ABC tax transparency, introducing global infrastructure or fixing global infrastructure to prevent the illicit flow of funds, and others. These measures were proposed, but whether they will come into fruition will be something to monitor as time passes by. Now, this is technically feasible. And what I mean by this is that on the technical level, it is very possible to achieve. But what the barrier is to this problem is the political obstruction, which includes the people who have the means and the power to lobby against international laws and laws created within their own country. And as Spencer mentioned, these are the same people that can do things, but they're the people that are engaging in this type of activity. So they don't really have any motivation to pursue regulation or to pursue changes. But we will see what happens, and we'll see what the reactions are from each country and how it's going to kind of move forward as we monitor the news. And maybe we'll give you an update later, but we'll see.
And actually, kind of thinking about this on an interesting level, I think that this year there was an interesting book that was published. It's going to sound like it's completely off topic, but I will totally tell you that this actually makes a lot of sense. There's a book that was published by former Speaker of the House named John Boehner. He's a Republican. And nowadays he'd be pretty much a centrist. He was definitely a lot more of a Republican when he first got elected. And he actually exposed the House originally when he came into office. And what happened was he in particular started realizing that everything in the U.S. House of Representatives was done through a House bank. And the story goes pretty much like this. He realized at some point in time that the Congress people can't keep a balanced checkbook. And the issue that persists with something like this is once he found out that they can't keep a balanced checkbook, that they didn't have to worry about it because what was paying for their misbalances was the American taxpayer. Okay. And what he did was he went out and he asked the Democratic Party to go and actually do a real investigation of this. And once the investigation got approved, they found out and exposed a ton of people. And it's very similar to what's happening now. And he himself enacted legislation and eventually got enough support to find a way to avoid this happening. It's kind of a very similar situation. The way that something like this can probably get fixed is with people that are like John Boehner in a current state of society, turning around and saying, this is really us exposing this problem. We need to pass through this legislation now, and really continuously proposing this idea and gaining support of the people to get it to pass. And that's exactly that. I think that's a really good comparison. That book, once again, is called On the House. I'll put that book in the description. I actually did not have any notes about that prior to this podcast, and I was like, hey, actually, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know what you think about that, YuYu, but I think that's actually a really good comparison to explain like what's happening right now.
Yeah, I think if you have the time to, like, go check it out because it sounds like it is very relevant in the conversation surrounding the Pandora Papers and like what's been going on recently. How do we deal with this problem? Is there anything that we're doing to actually deal with this problem right now? But like other than that, we've spilled a whole bunch of tea. We've dived into some of the controversies that's happening. And now we get to the part where we talk about the Extemp question. And this week's Extemp question is kind of peculiar. It's a little different and it's a little broad. So we're going to try our best to kind of cover what we can. But just keep in mind that there are going to be other questions surrounding other countries that might bring up this controversy in terms of like, how will this country deal with the Pandora paper controversy or something like that? So the question that we have today is, will the Pandora Papers have a sizable geopolitical impact? So Spencer, if you want to start us off.
If I want to, okay. No, so I want to just kind of start by saying this. This is kind of what we talked about at the beginning of this episode. Most of your questions are going to be very descriptive, and that's kind of what this is. Yes, it's kind of this is definitely a predictive question because of will. But a lot of this is still more describing about what's going on with it. And to me, that makes this a very hard question. Kind of what I put here on my notes, just kind of generally for the question is, I don't like this question. If I was to really be asked this question, I would probably throw it out. And here's the thing. This is just a really vague question. Are the Pandora Papers, do they have a sizable global impact? Well, here's the problem with just that general statement. Sizable geopolitical impact. Geopolitical is another fancy word for international relations. And that will keep it very simplified. That's a really good way to put it. And when we use that term, that means 117 different countries are affected. And you don't have time for 117 points, because that's the truth, is international relations with these countries is what that's asking. Does it have a sizable geopolitical impact? Well, you're affecting so many different countries. What are you going to talk about? And you have to find a way to narrow it down, and it makes it so difficult to do that in any kind of reasonable way. Then the second part to that makes this a really tough question. Once again, it's way too large of a scale. You have 117 different countries that are being affected. So are you going to narrow it to the United States, Russia, and Jordan? Are you going to narrow it to the United States, Russia, and the UK? Are you going to do the UK, Russia, and Jordan? Are you going to do... There's just way too many ways to look at this question, which makes it... I think this is definitely a question I would throw out right away. And I'm just being completely fair. I think for the purpose of this podcast, it's not a bad question, because we're really talking about like the impact of this and why this is important. But if you were really to get this as an Extemp question, I would absolutely advise everybody to not take it, because it's way too vague and there's way too many answers, and you don't have enough time. There's no way. Enough of my ranting aside. So here's how I would go about answering this. I'm pretty split on this question, personally. I think that the answer that most people would take would probably be no. And my reasoning for that is, I think it's struggling to reach the public level. I think what really happened is, I mean, you can go back to what YuYu has stated, that people are like kind of covering up this story in different countries and so on and so forth. But even in the United States, where a story gets published and it doesn't get taken down because we have freedom of the press, I'm not going to lie, I didn't even know about this topic until a week ago, personally. And YuYu was the one who told me. Okay? So we're talking about something that I, quite frankly, have never seen pop up on my news feed. I have not really seen any kind of form of that, which means that personally, just in the United States, the Pandora Papers are really struggling to reach the public. And anecdotal evidence, sure, but this is a really big problem. If it's really going to have a sizable international relations like impact, then what needs to happen is the public is the one that needs to be informed. And especially if we're talking about the United States or the United Kingdom, don't you want some kind of action to take place? Don't you want people to try to say, we need to get something done about this? Don't we want some form of numerical majority to walk in place and fix this issue? And the answer is I would think so. But if these journalists did all of this research to reveal this much information, then I think not seeing it like pop up on the news feed every 2 seconds is a real big problem. Right? And like just looking at that from a general perspective is a really like big issue. Um, and I think that's enough said on the no there. I don't think journalists are really pushing this as much as they should. Um, I haven't really ran across like a New York Times article either on this, and I don't know about YuYu, but it's been really hard to find like the big name sources to report on this, and that's a really big problem in my eyes. How you can answer this is yes, though. I think that, I mean, I could read through you the statistics that I provided earlier. Those statistics tell the whole story. Okay, and that makes there to be strong reasons why different countries are going to want to attack one another. Not attack, but like turn around and really say, you need to get your problem fixed. And maybe it would be, if you fix your problem, we'll fix ours kind of thing. And that really can change the scale of everything, right? You can see more pressure that's put on Russia to try to impose Vladimir Putin to actually do the right thing, which probably won't happen, but it's worth a shot. The United Kingdom can find ways to implement better laws that can help make sure that they're getting appropriate taxes. The United States can implement laws that YuYu was mentioning. Transparency is a really big one. Transparency laws been a common topic now for a couple weeks on our podcast. It's really, it really does have a pressure deal, because when a whole bunch of journalists reveal this information, it shows that other countries need to start taking action towards or other countries are going to start taking action towards their country and lead to a real like, hey, you got to change this kind of thing. But I honestly think that most people are going to answer this with no, because it's very difficult to find, like, I'm particularly myself, it's very difficult to like find a good credible source, and even then it's not popping up on the news as much as it really should, especially considering that it's as many journalists as it was. This just shocks me that it's not like being pushed more than it is.
I'm gonna like disagree with Spencer a little bit. I do like the nature of this question. I'm not gonna lie. Maybe it is an unpopular opinion, but like I love these types of questions. Broad questions, that's where it is. And the reason why I like broad questions is it allows for broad but in-depth analysis. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So it's a broad question, like it reaches a lot because it's talking about a geopolitical impact, in which case it's talking about the international community. But in which case, when it talks so broadly, you can also address the question broadly too. And that just means instead of having to focus specifically on a country and specifically how it works out through the country, you can consider it in the context of how it works out in the international community when everybody is interconnected and everybody is associated with the Pandora Papers. So, for example, will the Pandora Papers have a sizable geopolitical impact? It's easy. Pick yes or pick no. You don't really have to think much about it. Just like pick one and go with the flow. If you were to pick yes, there's some sources that we have linked down below. And I also like a little bit disagree with the sources part. I do agree that this hasn't been as big of an issue as news sources has made it out to be. But if you go on to like the New York Times, if you go to the Washington Post, if you go to the Wall Street Journal and type in the search bar Pandora Papers, I am sure that a lot of pieces will pop up and like have reports on it. You just have to do the digging yourself on their websites. But back to, if you were to say yes to this question, you can find sources that are like, we have sources listed that talks about how basically it is enacting change. For example, in the United States, we're already enacting change. In the international community, it has already sparked outlash among the people, and people want more like transparency. And as we've already talked about and discussed, the UN Financial Accountability, Transparency, and Integrity Panel is looking at implementing more measures in order to address this issue by having more transparency, by restructuring their architecture so that there is less illicit flow of money, and stuff like that. So in a sense, by sparking the conversation of having more transparency and more reforms, it does have a sizable geopolitical impact because countries are taking notice and countries are doing something, and the international community is doing something as a whole. But if you go the route of no, that's completely fine too. We have sources listed down below that talks about how, because the people who are doing the same activity is in power to dictate whether or not anything happens with the Pandora Papers, there's not really going to be that big of an impact because they're going to be the ones that stops those reforms from happening, or stops this type of restructuring or like more transparency from happening, because they want to keep the same structure. They still want to be able to have the same access to power. And all of these are viable options for your answer, but the way that you would structure your 3 points for broad questions is in the context of the broad international community. So for example, if you go yes, you could have 1 point be about how there's already backlash from the international community and give specific examples within countries, but you don't really have to elaborate further. I would pick like 1 or 2 countries to elaborate on to prove that backlash is happening within the point. And then you could do another point about how this now has sparked reforms and stuff like that. And maybe you want to like spice up your speech a little bit, give a thinking point, and have your 3rd point be whether or not these reforms will come into fruition. And that would just be like a well-rounded speech for like a yes. And it's so super easy to kind of put together because you don't really have to go too in depth. You just kind of have to provide the examples to prove your points and to prove your analysis, which is like my favorite type of question. But generally, when it comes to like sources and stuff, what I would say is, if it is like, if you ever get into a round and you find questions that you have nothing on, or like no sources on and no idea what it's about, save that question in the back of your head, like write it down on a piece of paper. And once you are done with the tournament or done with that round in particular, go online and go to big news sources like The Guardian, The New York Times, and look up that topic, see if they've reported anything, and read up on it so that if it pops up in your next round or if it pops up at another tournament, you're well prepared and you can like answer it generally. So fun fact and good tip in the video, I guess. But I guess that would be my take on the question.
You could tell somebody who knows how to answer a broad question compared to somebody who doesn't. And that's a completely like fair way to look at it, right? And it's also imperative to know that, once again, walking into this, I had no like real knowledge of the Pandora Papers, right? And this is going to happen sometimes in an Extemp round. This is really good advice right here from somebody who is literally sitting there going, what the heck is this, right? What I did was I literally read one article and I gave you everything that I could find off of that article. And guess what? I found a load of information, right? And as we continue to go on and we discussed the question more, we were able to find more analogies and maybe better ties going into John Boehner's book. Once again, this is a really good way to look at how to do this. So I will also give kind of my feedback here. Just more of like, I like YuYu's answers a lot more than mine. Go with that. Okay. Here's the thing that I will mention though. That's a better way to route a question like this, but you're going to have to be very careful. Because the one fear that I have, and the one reason why I don't take questions like this and why I very much don't like them, is, let's say we take the approach of broad question, broad answer, okay? What happens is you can give examples back and forth all day, and we'll just say we give the yes answer, and as you was saying, there's already been some push for it, right? And but you're going to have to provide examples. Is it better to keep the example consistent, or do you want to mention a number of different places? So will you go from talking about Jordan to Russia to US in that point? Or are you going to stick with only what's happening in the US? Or are you only going to stick with the United Kingdom? And once again, you fall into the same conundrum in which if you go and explain different examples about what's going on, you can lose your judge. There is no doubt. And your judge can become quickly lost on where we really are in the speech. And that's speaking not from a technical perspective. That's speaking from somebody who's not taking any notes, right? If I was taking notes, right, which is something that I do, and I flow in extemp speech very different from a lot of people, I personally, my thought of extemp is it's structured, and if you have a good structure, you're good. Okay, that's the way that I look at it. And admittedly, that's how most former speech and debaters look at it. Coaches will oftentimes more look at structure plus like kind of just general speaking. And if you're general speaking to a regular like judge that isn't a coach or a previous speech and debate student, if you're going from different countries and using different kinds of examples, it can get very confusing. And that is just being completely honest. Jumping from one problem to the next is just, it's so difficult. And it's what makes topics like this very hard to some people, right? And once again, this is all based on your taste of like, do you like a broad question? Do you want to answer it with a broad answer? But there is a real risk in taking a question like this. And I think that people should be aware of it. There's a real risk in taking any question, first off. This one is, for me, particularly one that I avoided a lot. And when I did end up taking these questions, I personally did not do well because these were really brutal questions because there wasn't a real good way to answer. And you quickly lose judges that are from the community. They get lost very fast with these kinds of questions. And that's just something I've learned from a little bit of time. But if this ends up being the option that you have to take, I would say that YuYu has a very good method of it. I like her answers. I think that she did a phenomenal job of explaining it through. Made sense to me. Hey, obviously, I'm still former speech and debater, but I think that it is important to illustrate this, and that you will end up with a real problem in the instance that you don't know really what's going to come across. And that's nothing against what YuYu has to say. It's just a really important thing to consider. There is a definite up and downside to this question, and it's kind of one of those that I would take a 50-50 bet on. If you have a better question, I would take the better question. And I think you would agree with me on that statement.
Yeah, I agree to the extent. I guess it just depends on like your personal interests and like your personal takes on questions. If you have a type of question that you prefer, that's completely fine. And that doesn't mean that like you should never take these types of broad questions. If you like taking them, take them. If you have a good approach to them and you're doing well, there's no problem with that whatsoever. So like don't be afraid to experiment, I would say, especially for the novices that are starting their season and are doing extemp. Don't be afraid to kind of branch out to different types of questions and experiment with what type of extemp style you want to adopt as an extemper. Another thing that I would just mention is that framing is a very important part of your extemp speech. And I think the reason why I have been successful with these questions is because I framed it in a way that made sense to the structure of my speech and my points. If you frame it in the sense of like, so for example, in this question, if you frame it in the sense that like it's pushing the United States to do something, therefore it has big geopolitical impact. It has a big geopolitical impact because the United States is very interconnected with the international community. That's a good frame to go with. Or if like generally you just want to go even more broader than that and don't want to tie in a specific country, you can just say if it draws in the UN to actually do something and say something about it, then it has a big geopolitical impact because it is, you know, an organization multiple countries are a part of and are willing to comment about and like go to like have solutions and to adopt some of the things that the UN has said, which gives like a big geopolitical impact overall because then those people take it back to their countries. So like just decide on which type of frame that you want to go with. When doing your speech though, you don't necessarily have to say like how you're going to frame your like answer to the question. All you really have to do is to just remember that this is how you're framing the question and always tie that back within your answers. But you don't have to explicitly say that. I just want to mention that.
I think the big lesson to learn here, and kind of another good way to explain framing is structure. Once again, like structure is key. And I don't think a lot of explanation is being said about that anymore. Because Extemp, especially in the last at least 15 years, has become more structured. It's not an event that's as focused on public speaking or as on speaking as much as it has been on structure and organization. And I find that organization and framing and structuring, if you start learning that, your content and your speaking becomes better. And that's what a lot of people have found in the last few years. So framing, I think, is probably the key to this episode and to the key of this really big question. And I think that's a really good place to wrap it up. The lesson to learn here is frame the answers the best, do more research than what I did, and you'll be okay.
Yeah. And just like a quick side note about framing. When we talk about framing, we're not like bringing in debate jargon or like fancy jargon to talk about something else. When we talk about framing, we mean like framing, like how you're doing everything and structuring everything. That's what we mean by framing. But yeah, I agree. It's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you, all of you, for listening into this very long episode and letting us spill the tea about all these rich billionaires that are out there. Uh, but yeah, like let us know how you did. Let us know how we're doing. Get the one in the round. Don't be shy to like comment on our YouTube page. It really helps. Subscribe to our channel. Click the bell. Don't forget to click the bell. I've always wanted to say that. And yeah, just like DM us if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. You know my Instagram, you know Spencer's Instagram, you know our emails. If not, you can just comment on our YouTube page. And also, this is like random idea, but if we get 50 likes on this video, 50 likes.
Wow, we're
right.
ambitious.
We might run a cheap to free Extemp camp sometime to be announced. But let's get to 50 likes first, and then we'll talk about everything later. But yeah, subscribe to the YouTube channel. You might actually be very involved in deciding whether or not we're going to do this topic or that topic.
I'm actually 100% down for that Extemp camp idea. So, and I will admit that usually there's at least 2 likes on a video, so it's got to be 52. So, I think because I know those 2 likes are both me, I 100% mess with the YouTube algorithm. So it's going to be 52 likes.
Yeah. Okay. So if you want to like talk to us, get 50 likes on this channel, or not channel, on this episode.
But yeah, great place to end it. As always, or we might actually have a pretty cool episode next week. Stay tuned. Stay tuned. subscribes so you get the episode early. Um, thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, we will see you all later.